December 20th, 1944, somewhere in the frozen hell of Germany, an American sergeant named Elmer Richardson lies bleeding out on a stone operating table, his intestines shredded by a German bullet, his liver nicked, his body failing. Around him, Wehrmacht officers bark orders in harsh German, but above him stands Dr. Ludwig Gruber, a man who has spent years operating on mangled bodies on the Eastern Front, who has seen horrors that would break lesser men. And Ludwig is making a choice that could cost him everything. He's about to spend hours, precious, irreplaceable hours, fighting to save the life of an enemy soldier, while his own countrymen bleed to death in the hallways outside. This is not the story you learned in school. This is not about heroes and villains, good guys and bad guys. This is about something that commanders on both sides never expected, something that the Geneva Convention tried to codify but could never truly capture. The profound humanity that emerged when men whose job was to heal confronted men whose bodies had been destroyed by war. Because here's what nobody tells you about World War II. In thousands of aid stations, field hospitals, and bombed-out churches across Europe, enemy medics saved more Allied lives than anyone could have predicted. And in doing so, they created bonds that transcended the brutality of the most destructive conflict in human history. The statistics tell part of the story. In World War II, for the first time in modern warfare history, more soldiers died in battle than from disease, 291,557 combat deaths versus 113,042 from other causes. The survival rate for the wounded climbed to an astonishing 50%, up from a mere 4% in World War I. But numbers can't capture the individual moments of grace, the split-second decisions made by exhausted medics who chose to see the humanity in their enemies rather than just another uniform. What drove these men to risk court-martial, to defy their superior officers, to spend precious resources on soldiers who hours earlier had been trying to kill them? The answer reveals something profound about human psychology under extreme stress, about cultural values that persist even when civilization itself seems to be collapsing, and about the unexpected ways that technology and ethics intersect on the battlefield. So let me ask you this. If you were that German doctor, with your own countrymen dying in the next room, would you have made the same choice? To understand how enemy medics became unlikely saviors, we need to go back to the 1920s and 1930s, to a world still reeling from the carnage of the First World War. The trenches of that earlier conflict had taught the world a brutal lesson about modern warfare. Artillery, machine guns, and poison gas could mangle human bodies in ways that traditional medicine was utterly unprepared to handle. In World War I, if you were wounded seriously enough to need surgery, you had about a 4% chance of survival. 4%. That meant for every 25 men who made it to a field hospital, 24 would die. The medical community knew something had to change. In the years between the wars, military medicine underwent a revolution. New antibiotics like sulfur drugs transformed infection from a death sentence into a manageable condition. Blood transfusion techniques improved dramatically. The concept of triage, sorting the wounded by urgency rather than rank or arrival time, became standardized. And crucially, the role of the combat medic evolved from a simple stretcher bearer into a trained medical professional who could stabilize wounded soldiers in the field. But there was another revolution happening simultaneously, one rooted in international law and humanitarian ethics. The Geneva Conventions, first established in 1864 and expanded in 1906 and 1929, attempted to create rules for warfare that would protect non-combatants, prisoners, and medical personnel. Article 24 of the Geneva Convention specified that medical personnel exclusively engaged in the search for or the collection, transport, or treatment of the wounded or sick should be respected and protected in all circumstances. This wasn't just humanitarian idealism. It was a practical recognition that both sides had medics, and if you started shooting enemy medics, your enemy would start shooting yours. It was a mutual survival pact dressed up in legal language. The architects of these conventions understood something profound about human psychology. Even in the depths of war, there exist universal values that transcend national boundaries. The instinct to heal the sick and wounded is one of the most fundamental human drives, embedded in cultures across the world. Ancient physicians took oaths to do no harm. Medieval knights had codes of chivalry that protected healers. The Geneva Convention simply tried to codify what most soldiers already felt in their bones. There was something fundamentally wrong about killing a man whose only weapon was a medical bag. Ludwig Gruber embodied this tradition. Born in Germany in the early 20th century, he completed his medical training in 1938, just as Europe was sliding inexorably toward war. He was drafted into the Wehrmacht in 1940, a young doctor with ideals about healing thrust into the meat grinder of the Eastern Front. Imagine what he saw there. Hundreds upon hundreds of soldiers on his operating table, bodies torn apart by bullets, shrapnel, frostbite. The Eastern Front was where German and Soviet forces slaughtered each other in the snow, where the rules of civilized warfare broke down completely, where both sides committed atrocities that still haunt historians today. That experience could have hardened Ludwig into cynicism, could have turned him into just another functionary in the Nazi war machine, but it didn't. When he found himself transferred to a field hospital in Hellenenberg, Germany, a converted abbey that still held the faint echoes of its monastic past, Ludwig brought with him a commitment to his medical ethics that would soon be tested in the most dramatic way possible. Across the Atlantic, another story was unfolding. Robert Wright, born in Ohio on February 9, 1924, was the son of working-class parents Bertha and Pearl Wright. After graduating from high school in 1942, with the world at war and America fully mobilized, he joined the 101st Airborne Division as a medic. Kenneth Moore, his future partner in one of the war's most remarkable medical operations, came from a similar background, a stretcher bearer trained to haul wounded soldiers out of the hell of combat and get them to safety. These men received training that was, by today's standards, shockingly inadequate. Combat medics learned to stop bleeding with tourniquets and pressure bandages, to sprinkle sulfur powder on wounds as a primitive antibiotic, to administer morphine for pain, and to make the agonizing decision about which wounded soldiers were beyond help and which might survive if given immediate care. More elaborate treatment would have to wait for the field hospitals in the rear. But even this basic training was enough to make the difference between life and death. The cultural context of the 1930s and early 1940s is crucial to understanding what happened next. This was a world divided by totalitarian ideologies, fascism, communism, democracy, each claiming to represent the highest expression of human civilization. Nazi propaganda portrayed Allied soldiers as subhuman enemies of the Reich. Allied propaganda returned the favor, depicting Germans as barbaric Huns bent on world domination. The psychological conditioning of soldiers on both sides emphasized dehumanization of the enemy, because it's much easier to kill someone you don't see as fully human. Yet underneath this veneer of propaganda, there remained a stubborn recognition that the men on the other side were, in fact, men. They had families, they felt pain, they bled the same red blood. And when a medic, whether German, American, British or Canadian, looked down at a wounded soldier, something primal kicked in that had nothing to do with nationality and everything to do with the fundamental human imperative to reduce suffering. The stage was set for a profound collision between ideology and humanity, between the demands of total war and the ethics of medical care. What nobody expected, not the generals planning operations, not the politicians making speeches, not even the soldiers themselves, was how often humanity would win. The obstacles facing medics who wanted to treat enemy wounded were immense and multi-layered, encompassing technical challenges, institutional resistance, psychological barriers, and the brutal calculus of triage under fire. Let's start with the most basic problem: resources. In a field hospital or aid station, every bandage, every vial of morphine, every pint of blood, every minute of a surgeon's time was precious beyond measure. When you had dozens or hundreds of your own wounded soldiers who needed care, how could you justify spending those resources on enemy combatants? This wasn't just a hypothetical question. Ludwig Gruber faced it directly when Elmer Richardson arrived at his operating table in December 1944. Elmer had been shot in the gut during a German ambush on December 18th. He evaded capture initially, but was apprehended 2 days later on December 20th, his wound festering, his condition deteriorating rapidly. The bullet had mangled his bowels, nicked his liver, and caused internal damage that would have killed most men. The hospital's commanding officers made their position clear to Ludwig. This was an enemy combatant. He didn't deserve the same care and comfort as a wounded German. Why waste hours on a man who would become a prisoner anyway, when German soldiers were dying for lack of medical attention? Ludwig's response was to ignore them completely. He spent hours in surgery with Elmer, performing techniques that were revolutionary for their time, resecting the damaged bowel, repairing internal injuries with a precision and care that would have been remarkable even for a German soldier, let alone an American enemy. When his superiors barked at him, demanding to know why he was spending so much time on an enemy when so many Germans needed help, Ludwig's response was brutally pragmatic. The time was spent. The American lived. There was no point in second-guessing it now. But Ludwig's defiance came with real costs. Every hour he spent on Elma was an hour he wasn't spending on German soldiers. The other wounded men in that hospital, young Germans, some barely out of their teens, fighting for a cause most of them didn't fully understand. They had to wait. Some of them probably died waiting. This is the moral calculus of war medicine that nobody talks about. Sometimes saving one life means losing another. The trolley problem made flesh and blood. The psychological barriers were equally daunting. Consider the mindset of a soldier who has spent months or years fighting an enemy, watching friends die, living in constant fear of death. The natural human response to that trauma is to create psychological distance from the enemy, to see them as other, as less than human, as deserving of their fate. Military training reinforces this dehumanization because it makes soldiers more effective killers. But medics occupied a strange liminal space in this psychological landscape. Their job was to heal, not harm. They wore distinctive markings, the Red Cross armband, that theoretically protected them from being targeted, but also marked them as non-combatants. More than 500,000 American service members suffered some form of psychiatric collapse during World War II due to combat stress. 40% of medical discharges were psychiatric in nature. The psychological toll of treating wounded soldiers, making life or death decisions under fire, watching young men die despite your best efforts, living with the knowledge that you can't save everyone, was immense. And yet medics were expected to maintain their humanity, to see each wounded soldier as an individual deserving of care, even when that soldier wore the uniform of the enemy. Robert Wright and Kenneth Moore faced these challenges in the most acute form imaginable during the D-Day invasion of June 6, 1944. The two medics were part of the 101st Airborne Division, dropped behind enemy lines in the early hours of the invasion. But their drop went catastrophically wrong. We were supposed to be dropped at 700 feet at 95 miles per hour, which was enough to get our parachute to open and get our equipment down safely, recalled another medic from that drop, but they dropped us at 300 feet at 165 miles per hour, which is almost impossible to survive. Wright and Moore found themselves in Untold, a tiny French village that was about to become the site of vicious fighting between American paratroopers and German defenders. The village church, named for St. Cosmas and St. Damian, 4th century martyrs, who were physicians in ancient Syria, became their aid station. They hung a Red Cross flag and gave a simple order: all rifles would be left outside the church door. This was to be a sanctuary, a place where the killing stopped. The wounded began streaming in almost immediately. Wright organized them on the pews with their heads facing the aisle and their feet facing the walls, a configuration that maximized the limited space. He practiced battlefield triage, placing the most gravely wounded near the altar where he could monitor them constantly, and placing those he believed were not going to survive behind the altar. A brutal but necessary acknowledgement that he couldn't save everyone. Then the German wounded began arriving. Some were carried in by American soldiers who couldn't bring themselves to leave an injured man to die. Others staggered in on their own, and Wright and Moore faced a choice. Do we treat them? Do we risk dividing our limited medical supplies between American and German soldiers? Do we potentially save the life of a man who, once recovered, might pick up a rifle and kill our comrades? They treated them. About a dozen Germans ended up in that church, alongside American paratroopers and French civilians. The medics made no distinction based on uniform. Outside, the battle raged. The village of Untold changed hands multiple times over 3 days. Possession lurched back and forth between American and German forces. At times the fighting came so close that mortar rounds hit the church itself. One mortar came through the roof, but miraculously failed to explode, though it smashed through the ceiling and hit Kenneth Moore in the head, causing him to bleed and later earning him a Purple Heart. For 72 hours, Wright and Moore received no supplies and no sleep. They continued to treat the wounded with whatever materials they could scavenge. The bloodstains on those church pews, visible to this day, tell the story better than words ever could. More than 80 soldiers passed through that makeshift aid station, and while not all of them survived, many did who would have died without immediate medical care. The risks extended beyond the immediate dangers of combat. Captured medics occupied a peculiar position under the Geneva Conventions. They were not technically prisoners of war, but retained personnel who could be held by the capturing force to provide medical care to POWs. However, this legal distinction often meant nothing in practice. Captured medics frequently found themselves treated as regular prisoners, subjected to the same deprivations and abuses, or worse, forced to continue working under impossible conditions with inadequate supplies. Yet despite all these obstacles, the shortage of resources, the institutional resistance, the psychological trauma, the physical danger, the legal ambiguity, medics on both sides continued to make the choice to treat enemy wounded. The question is, why? What psychological and cultural factors made this possible? The answer lies in a series of remarkable stories that reveal the profound complexity of human behavior under extreme stress. These weren't isolated incidents of individual heroism. They were part of a broader pattern of medical professionals refusing to let ideology override their commitment to healing, and the consequences rippled outward in ways that changed the course of individual lives, military operations, and eventually the cultural memory of the war itself. Let's return to Ludwig Gruber and Elmer Richardson in that converted abbey in Hellenenberg, Germany, in late December 1944. Ludwig didn't just save Elmer's life with his surgical skill, though that alone would have been remarkable. He did something even more extraordinary. He befriended him. Think about that for a moment. This was December 1944. Germany was losing the war. Allied bombers were reducing German cities to rubble. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate offensive, was beginning. The Nazi regime was weeks away from final collapse. And a German doctor, who had every reason to be bitter, frightened, and focused solely on his own survival, took the time to write his address on a scrap of paper and give it to an enemy soldier, asking Elmer to write to him if he survived the war. But Ludwig wasn't finished. He fought to keep Elmer at the hospital under his care for an extra week, beyond what was medically necessary, arguing that the Americans' wounds needed more time to heal before he could be transferred to a POW camp. During that extra week, something happened that may have saved dozens or even hundreds of lives. A U.S. Army captain toured the hospital under a flag of truce, one of those strange interludes in warfare where enemies temporarily stop trying to kill each other. The captain met with Elmer and learned about the situation. He noticed that German military vehicles were parked at the hospital, making it a legitimate military target under the rules of war. The Americans were planning to bomb the area. The captain negotiated with the Germans. The Americans would not bomb if the Germans agreed not to park military equipment there. The deal was struck. The hospital was spared. As Elmer's son, Steve Richardson, would later reflect, how many lives were saved because Dr. Gruber had my father stay an extra week? We'll never know. The twist here is profound. An act of medical compassion, Ludwig extending Elmer's stay, created the circumstances for a military negotiation that likely saved both American and German lives. The supposedly wasted resources that Ludwig's superiors had complained about actually had strategic value that nobody could have predicted. When Elmer finally made it back to an American military hospital in Clinton, Iowa, surgeons photographed Ludwig's work. The surgical techniques were revolutionary for the time, so advanced that American doctors wanted to study them. After the war, Elmer wrote to Ludwig and thanked him for his kindness. Ludwig wrote back expressing his joy at Elmer's survival. Two men who had been mortal enemies discovered that the bond forged in that operating room was stronger than the ideologies that had put them at war. Ludwig practiced medicine into his 80s. He died in 1988. Elmer survived well beyond that, carrying with him the knowledge that he owed his life to an enemy's compassion. Another story adds a different dimension to this pattern. An American soldier named Mike, whose full name has been lost to history, found himself wounded and calling for a medic during combat. But the voice that answered wasn't American, it was German. Two German soldiers approached. One was a medic, the other a regular infantryman. The German medic stopped the bleeding in Mike's shoulder and patched him up as best he could with the supplies available. Then came the twist that nobody expected. The two Germans picked up Mike, put him in a coat, and dragged him to a cabin. They took his dog tags, standard procedure for identifying casualties, and left. Mike passed out. When he awoke, he was in an American aid station. The German medic had returned him to the Americans. Think about what that meant. A German medic in the middle of active combat took the time not just to treat an enemy soldier, but to physically carry him back to enemy lines and leave him where he would be found and cared for. This wasn't required by the Geneva Conventions. This wasn't militarily advantageous. This was pure human decency, operating in a context where decency had supposedly been abandoned. Mike spent the rest of his life searching for that German medic. He never found him. He never learned his name. But he never stopped wanting to say thank you. The psychological impact of being saved by an enemy is difficult to overstate. It fundamentally challenges the narratives of good versus evil, us versus them, that make warfare psychologically tolerable. Back in WWII, Wright and Moore were living through their own climactic moment. On June 8, 1944, the third day of their vigil in the church, the battle finally shifted decisively. American forces secured the area. The two medics had been awake for 72 hours straight, treating wounded soldiers, American, German, and French, with no regard for uniform. They had made an impossible situation work through sheer, stubborn humanity. The Germans they had treated didn't try to escape. They didn't try to kill the American medics when the opportunity arose. They simply accepted care and gave thanks. One of the most striking aspects of the WWII story is what didn't happen. Despite the church changing hands between American and German forces multiple times, despite moments when German soldiers could easily have captured or killed Wright and Moore, despite the chaos and fear and exhaustion, the integrity of the medical sanctuary held. A German officer named Friedrich Lengfeld provides another glimpse into this psychology. During fighting in November 1944, a wounded American soldier was calling for help in no man's land between the front lines. Lieutenant Lengfeld gave an explicit order to his German troops. Under no circumstances were they to shoot any American medics who might be approaching to rescue the wounded soldier. He wanted to allow the American medics to do their job. This was the mutual respect system in action, both sides recognizing that some things were more important than military advantage. The twist that commanders never expected was this: treating enemy wounded didn't weaken military effectiveness. It strengthened it. When soldiers knew that if they were wounded, they would receive care even if captured by the enemy, it reduced the psychological terror of combat. When medics maintained their humanitarian principles even under the most extreme stress, it preserved a sense of moral order in a world that seemed to have abandoned morality entirely. The acts of compassion weren't weaknesses to be exploited. They were the thin threads that kept men from descending into complete barbarism. The Geneva Conventions had tried to create these protections through legal language, but the reality was far messier and far more human. The system worked not because of laws, but because of shared humanity, mutual vulnerability, and the recognition that today's enemy might be tomorrow's savior. As one observer noted, medics often after fights in the field would help the wounded and dying. Medics and soldiers of both sides knew not to mess with the other cause. They knew, hey, if our situation gets overrun, that guy might be the guy looking at my wounds. The Pacific Theater, by contrast, showed what happened when this mutual respect broke down. Japanese forces often specifically targeted American medics because they knew how important they were to military effectiveness and morale. American troops responded by targeting Japanese medical personnel. The result was a spiral of brutality that made the Pacific War psychologically different from the European theater, more vicious, more dehumanizing, more traumatic for everyone involved. But in Europe, despite all the atrocities, despite the Holocaust, despite the carpet bombing and the siege warfare, and the brutal fighting from house to house, this strange code of medical honor persisted. German and American medics sometimes met in the middle of battlefields and worked together to treat wounded soldiers. Captured medics were often put to work treating casualties rather than being sent to POW camps. The distinctive Red Cross armbands mostly protected medical personnel from being targeted. Not perfectly, not universally, but enough to make a difference. The climax of this story isn't a single moment. It's thousands of moments scattered across Europe, each one a small victory of humanity over hatred. It's Ludwig spending hours on Elmer's surgery. It's the German medic carrying Mike back to American lines. It's Wright and Moore treating German wounded in their church sanctuary. It's Friedrich Lengfeld ordering his men not to shoot American medics. It's every moment when a man with a medical bag chose to see the wounded soldier in front of him as a human being rather than an enemy. The immediate post-war period revealed the full scope of what these medical interventions had accomplished. The 50% survival rate for wounded soldiers in World War II, compared to 4% in World War I, represented millions of men who lived instead of died, who returned home to families instead of being buried in foreign soil. But the statistics, while staggering, can't capture the ripple effects of individual acts of compassion that echoed through decades. Elmer Richardson lived a long life after the war, married, had children, became a productive member of his community. Every moment of that life, every smile, every conversation, every contribution he made to the world existed because Ludwig Gruber chose to see him as a human being rather than an enemy. When Elmer's son Steve tells his father's story, he's telling the story of his own existence, because without Ludwig's choice, Steve would never have been born. The same is true for Mike, the soldier saved by the unnamed German medic, and for the dozens of German soldiers treated by Wright and Moore in Untold, and for countless others whose names we'll never know. Each act of medical compassion created cascading consequences that extended far beyond the battlefield. The soldiers who survived went home, built families, taught their children, contributed to their communities. The medics who treated them carried those experiences throughout their lives, often becoming advocates for humanitarian causes and international medical ethics. The psychological and cultural impact was equally profound. The generation that fought World War II came home with complex, nuanced understandings of their enemies. They had seen that German soldiers were human beings, some good, some bad, most just ordinary men caught up in extraordinary circumstances. This made it possible for the post-war reconciliation between former enemies, for the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe, for NATO and the European Union, and all the institutions that prevented World War III. Robert Wright and Kenneth Moore were awarded Silver Star medals for their actions at Untold. They both served in other battles, including the Battle of the Bulge, and both survived the war. The church at Untold became a pilgrimage site, preserved with its blood-stained pews and cracked flagstones as a memorial to medical heroism. The locals believed that the appearance of Wright and Moore on that fateful morning wasn't mere chance but something more, perhaps divine intervention, given that the church takes its name from St. Cosmas and St. Damian, physician martyrs from the 4th century. The story resonated because it revealed something universal about human nature. In a war defined by industrial-scale killing, by genocide, by the destruction of entire cities, these small acts of medical compassion became symbols of the possibility of redemption. They suggested that even in the depths of humanity's worst instincts, the better angels of our nature could still prevail. The medical innovations developed during World War II had enormous post-war applications. The surgical techniques that Ludwig used to save Elmer became standard practice. The triage systems developed by combat medics formed the basis for modern emergency medicine. The use of blood transfusions, antibiotics, and rapid evacuation procedures, all refined under the pressures of war, transformed civilian trauma care. Every time a car accident victim survives because of rapid emergency response, they're benefiting from lessons learned by medics treating wounded soldiers in places like Untold. The Geneva Conventions were updated again in 1949, incorporating lessons learned from World War II about the treatment of medical personnel, prisoners of war, and civilians. The protections for retained medical personnel were strengthened and clarified. The concept of protected medical facilities was expanded. These legal changes reflected a growing international consensus that some aspects of humanity needed to be preserved even in war. But perhaps the most important legacy was cultural and psychological. The stories of enemy medics saving Allied lives became part of the collective memory of the war, passed down through families, commemorated in memorials, studied by military historians. They complicated the simple narratives of heroic allies versus evil axis, suggesting instead that morality in warfare is situational, contextual, and deeply human. The fact that these stories continue to resonate decades after the war ended speaks to a deep human need to find meaning and hope, even in our darkest moments. Ludwig Gruber practiced medicine into his 80s, never seeking recognition for what he did, never claiming to be a hero. When Elmer wrote to him after the war, Ludwig's response was simple. He was just doing his job, just following the ethics he had learned in medical school, just being the kind of doctor he wanted to be. The humility is characteristic of these medical professionals. They didn't see themselves as doing anything extraordinary, even though their actions were profoundly extraordinary by any reasonable measure. The cultural impact extended into popular memory and media representations of the war. Films, books, and documentaries have increasingly explored the nuances of enemy interactions, moving away from the propaganda-style depictions common during and immediately after the war. The recognition that enemy soldiers were human beings, that German medics saved American lives, that moments of compassion occurred even in the midst of horror, has allowed for a more mature understanding of warfare and its psychological toll. For veterans on both sides, the knowledge that medical personnel maintained their humanitarian principles even under extreme stress provided a psychological anchor. Combat produces moral injuries that can be as debilitating as physical wounds. The guilt of killing, the trauma of watching friends die, the challenge of reconciling one's actions in war with one's peacetime values. But the medics who treated enemy wounded could look back on their service with the knowledge that they had preserved their humanity when everything around them was pushing toward dehumanization. The village of Angoville-au-Plain maintains the church as it was in 1944, preserving the blood-stained pews and damaged floor as a living memorial. French schoolchildren learn about Wright and Moore as examples of heroism and humanitarian values. Every year on the anniversary of D-Day, ceremonies honor the medics who treated soldiers without regard to uniform. The church has become a symbol not just of American heroism, but of universal human values that transcend nationality and ideology. The medical ethics demonstrated by these medics influenced post-war thinking about medical professionalism more broadly. The idea that medical care should be provided based on need rather than identity, that doctors treat patients, not enemies, became enshrined in international medical ethics codes. The World Medical Association's Declaration of Geneva, adopted in 1948, includes the pledge, "I will not permit considerations of age, disease, or disability, creed, ethnic origin, gender, nationality, political affiliation, race, sexual orientation, social standing, or any other factor to intervene between my duty and my patient." That principle was tested and proven on the battlefields of World War II. The psychological research on combat stress and trauma that emerged from World War II also owes a debt to the observations of medics who treated soldiers from both sides. They noticed that the symptoms of combat exhaustion, the crying, tremor, emotional lability, were identical whether the soldier was American, British, or German. This universality of traumatic response helped establish that psychiatric casualties were genuine medical conditions rather than character flaws or cowardice, paving the way for modern understanding and treatment of PTSD. The legacy of enemy medics saving Allied lives is ultimately a story about the resilience of human decency under the most extreme conditions imaginable. It's a reminder that we are not prisoners of our circumstances, that we always have choices, even when those choices are difficult, and that small acts of compassion can have profound consequences that echo through generations. Every person alive today whose grandfather or great-grandfather was saved by an enemy medic carries that legacy in their very existence. So what does this mean for us today, more than 80 years after these events? The lessons from enemy medics saving Allied lives in World War II remain urgently relevant in our current moment of division, conflict, and humanitarian crisis. When we dehumanize our political opponents, when we reduce complex human beings to stereotypes and caricatures, when we allow ideology to override empathy, we're making the same mistakes that prolonged the brutality of war. But when we choose to see the humanity in everyone, even those we disagree with, even those we're in conflict with, we're following in the footsteps of Ludwig Gruber, Robert Wright, Kenneth Moore, and thousands of other medical professionals who refused to let hatred win. The story of these medics challenges us to ask difficult questions. When have I had the opportunity to help someone I consider an enemy, and did I take it? When have I let ideological commitments override basic human compassion? What would I have done in Ludwig's position, with my own countrymen bleeding in the hallways, while an enemy soldier lay dying on my operating table? These aren't comfortable questions, but they're essential ones if we want to learn anything meaningful from history. If your family has connections to World War II, if your grandfather or great-grandfather served, if you have stories passed down through generations about the war, I want to hear them. Drop a comment below sharing your family's experiences. Did someone in your family receive medical care from enemy personnel? Did they witness acts of compassion across battle lines? These stories are precious, and as the generation that lived through World War II passes away, it becomes increasingly important to preserve their memories and the lessons they contain. For medical professionals watching this, the legacy of World War II combat medics should serve as an inspiration and a reminder of your profession's highest values. When you're exhausted, when resources are scarce, when the patient in front of you is difficult or unlikable, or even hostile, remember Ludwig Gruber spending hours on enemy surgery. Remember Wright and Moore treating German wounded in their church sanctuary. Your obligation is to the patient, not to ideology. Your job is to heal, period. If this story moved you, hit that like button. It helps the algorithm show this video to more people who need to hear these lessons. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified when I post the next video in this series, where I'll be exploring another unexpected aspect of World War II innovation and humanity. Share this video with someone who needs to hear the message that compassion is not weakness, that treating enemies with humanity is not betrayal, that medical ethics matter even, especially, in the most extreme circumstances. The next video will explore another dimension of this theme, how soldiers on both sides used music and art to maintain their humanity in the midst of mechanized killing, and how those creative expressions became bridges across enemy lines. It's another story that commanders never expected, another example of human resilience in the face of dehumanizing circumstances. You won't want to miss it. Finally, I want to leave you with this thought. The world is facing multiple humanitarian crises right now. Wars, refugee flows, natural disasters, pandemics. In each of these situations, medical professionals and humanitarian workers are making choices about whom to treat and how to allocate scarce resources. They're facing the same dilemmas that Ludwig Gruber and Robert Wright and Kenneth Moore faced. And most of them are choosing, as those World War II medics did, to see the humanity in everyone who needs help, regardless of nationality, ideology, or identity. They're the inheritors of this legacy. Support them, honor them, and if you get the chance, follow their example. Because in the end, the story of enemy medics saving Allied lives isn't just about World War II. It's about the fundamental choice we all face every day. Do we let our worst instincts, our tribalism, our fear, our hatred define us, or do we insist, against all the pressures pushing us toward dehumanization, that every human life has value? Ludwig Gruber made his choice on that operating table in December 1944. What choice will you make? Thank you for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, and share. And never forget, humanity persists, even in humanity's darkest hours.